Okay, welcome to my YouTube channel, guys. Thanks for finding this place. For the next 10 or so minutes, I want to do a presentation with you here on Chapter 13, Section 3. The due date we'll share in class because of the snow that we've been having. I don't know the exact due date that this will be due, but we'll make sure that's posted for you. I ask that as we're going through here together, you fill in any notes on the handout that you were given. Feel free to pause during this presentation to write down your things you need to know, go back, watch this again, and once again, you can always shoot me a remind message or an email or see me in before class if you have any questions. But let's get right into it. So far in this unit, we've been focusing on this idea of America's second industrial revolution. Chapter 13, as it shows on this slide, is called The Expansion of American Industry. We've been talking about these new developments, these new devices, these new inventions that America is starting to develop post-Civil War, and different ways that these competitors, these entrepreneurs, these business owners that are willing to take risks and do great things are trying to do to get a leg up on their competition. So what we want to focus on here in Section 3, and the reason we're doing this as a video is because I want to spend time in class focusing on a simulation that explains a lot of these things. But what we want to focus on here is what the worker's going through at this time. The American worker was really what I would call the backbone of this entire movement. This idea that the worker was not valuable and that just the Rockefellers and the Carnegies were is just not true. So let's start at the beginning. As this slide shows us here, America was perfect for an industrial boom. We had so many things going for us that a lot of other countries lacked and needed to get from foreign nations. We had all the natural resources we needed to be successful. We had oil, we had iron ore, we had gold and silver and copper. We had a wealthy class that rose up after the Civil War of people who had money and wanted to advance their businesses and were willing to take risks to get ahead, which is largely what we call entrepreneurs. We had a transportation industry that was willing to support us with railroads and canals and a better road system. And as we've been talking about the last several days in class, these new inventions, the railroad development, transcontinental railroad, electricity and telephones, the steel industry, all of these things were so significant. But in my opinion, what I think was most significant was how many workers really provided the backbone of the Industrial Revolution. Without American work, without American workers, there's no way any of this stuff gets done. And as you see on the slide here, the book starts off by basically telling us that without this influx of American worker, there's no way this revolution takes place. And we really got these this influx of workers from two places in American cities where most of these factories were located. One, we got them from other countries. America became a huge destination for migrants, especially from Europe and even from Asia, coming to the United States. As this statistic shares, between 1860 and 1900, 14 million people immigrated to America. And at the same time, with some of these new developments that we've talked about in class, there's not as much need for farm workers in these big rural areas. A lot of new developments have created less of a need for these kinds of workers, so a lot of people from rural areas are also flocking to cities as well. So as a result of all of these things going for America, it's a perfect situation for this industrial revolution. But once again, you need workers, and that's what was really the significance of Section 3 and why I wanted to spend a few minutes talking to you about it tonight. But here's the thing. Today, workers, in my opinion, are very valued in society. If you're a worker and you're good at something, people care about you. They pay you money. They treat you right. They give you the necessary conditions of work you need to be successful. That's not the way it was during this time in the late 1800s. The focus in the late 1800s was to make money, to make as much money as possible. And however a factory owner had to do that, they did that. And it often meant taking advantage of their workers. Two definitions that are big here is piecework and sweatshops. And we're going to talk about both of them in class. We've actually already talked about piecework before. If you guys remember the newspaper circles activity we did earlier this year, every time you guys made a circle out of newspaper, whether you had scissors or not, I gave you a certain amount of dollars based on each one. That's what piecework is. When an employer would pay for workers for what they produce, not how much time they work. In this picture, if you look on the left here, you see a family sitting down and doing work. So imagine a family created the hours that they wanted. When they wanted to work, they worked, and at the end of a week or the end of the month, they made their money. Some factories did this process too, but factories to the point in the late 1800s, whether they were doing piecework or not, factories started to become a place that wasn't necessarily like you wanted to go to work. You had to go to work. And that's where these ideas of a sweatshop started to take place, a place where workers worked long hours at low wages under poor conditions. I Googled sweatshop, and this was one of the first pictures on the right of this slide here came up. Imagine a crowded area, crowded room, lots of machines, lots of people doing a lot of work, loud, noisy, what have you, for a long period of time. Once again, you're not thinking as a business owner about the best interests of the worker. You're not thinking about a clean, healthy working environment that they want to come back to every day. You're thinking about struggle. You're thinking about trying to get as much work done as possible in as little as time so you could make as much money as you could. And the worker, that, like I said, human capital was more of a secondary issue. So piecework, sweatshops, hopefully you're starting to get an idea that things are changing a little bit for the American worker. These factories were not about the worker, they were about the work, if that makes sense. It was all about increasing efficiency. We've talked a lot about efficiency so far this year. If you don't remember it, please look it up. Google it, look it up in the textbook. But when I think about efficiency, you're thinking about trying to do a valued output. You're trying to do something in as little time as possible. And as we've talked about with section 2 of this chapter, you're trying to do it in a better way or faster way, a more productive way than your competition. Remember, if you can do a job or you can do a certain type of work better than your competitor, that's going to allow you to offer a lower price. That's going to allow you to offer better quality. If you can get a leg up, so to speak, on your competition, it's only good. Could only result in usually a good thing for you. And that's where this idea of the division of labor comes in, a way of producing in which different tasks are performed by different persons to increase efficiency and productivity. In the late 1800s, this is what workers and specifically the workers, owners, and managers were thinking about. How can we do a job faster than ever before? And what we started to see was, instead of teaching someone how to do an entire prospect, an entire project, or an entire job, they would do a piece of a job, even if it was a minute detail that required almost no skill. The whole point was to do a job in as little time as possible. We already briefly touched on this, if you guys remember interchangeable parts earlier this year when we talked about Eli Whitney, where Eli Whitney, instead of teaching somebody how to make an entire gun in the late 1700s, taught them to make a piece of a gun. So then everything was standardized and everything could come together a little quicker. So this isn't necessarily a brand new idea, but it definitely becomes a huge detail that all workers, all factories are focused on doing, trying to find a better way to produce an object, to produce a system in a better way than your competition. And this is really what we're going to try to simulate in class when we cover chapter 13, section 3. So if you're still a little bit foggy on it, a couple of things. 1, remember interchangeable parts. Remember Eli Whitney. 2, just wait for class. We're going to go over this in great detail. 3, I found a nice little YouTube video that's only about 3 minutes long that if you are looking or struggling a little bit and you want to get a little more information, feel free to take a look at this YouTube slide. Not required, but at the same time, it's for about 3 minutes, and it just gives a little bit of a better idea of what division of labor is. But the idea is trying to stay unique to your product. How can I make my product better? How can I do it faster? How can I do it quicker? And how can I do it better than my competitor? And I'm really excited to do this simulation with you guys in class and hope to make it a little bit more clear for you. So let's put it all together here real quick. The way that the textbook ends section 3 is just by talking about some of these impacts that the late 1900s, the second industrial revolution, had for the American worker. And I just want to share these with you real quick. Workers performed one piece of the process, not the entire process. And sometimes that was good for the worker because you didn't have to have a huge level of background knowledge, but sometimes it's not that great because now you don't necessarily need to be all that good at something to do it. And if you're not doing it well, or if you're complaining, or if they can find somebody that's going to do it cheaper than you, they probably will. So job security wasn't as strong at this time for the average worker than it might be today. Workers were also much more expendable. Since it was easier to train, hire, fire, or replace people, if you're going to complain, if you're going to demand more money, if you're going to demand better wages or more vacation time, they're probably just going to find somebody that's not going to complain as much. And once again, the leg that the workers stood on wasn't that strong, and that's why in Section 4, we're going to move on and talk a little bit about what workers did in terms of forming labor unions and other collectives to try to stop being taken advantage of by these owners. And here's another big one. The workers lived by the clock. Their lives were completely ruled by the clock. You now did not work when you felt like it. You didn't work when you had time. You worked when the clock struck 7 a.m. And then you worked for 12 hours or 10 hours or 14 hours, however long the factory wanted you to work, you would work. Because once again, the factories were about profits. It was not about you. It was about the output of the material or the process or whatever you were making. Workplaces also tended to be less safe. They were noisy. They were unclean. The government wasn't really involved at this time in regulating how these things were going, so they were unsafe. And we're going to talk at the very end of our school year about how the government and people finally kind of said, enough of this, stop taking advantage of us and help us out here, government. We need your help. And another unfortunate byproduct at this time is that child labor grew significantly. Once again, how do you make your product in as little money or in as little time as possible? And if you can hire a 14-year-old kid to do it or a 15-year-old kid to do it like you guys for half the price of an adult, you were going to do that. And unfortunately, by 1900, 1 out of every 20 people working in the factory system, 5% of the American factory workforce were kids. Being a kid meaning you were less than 16 years old. And you weren't just working like part-time at McDonald's here on the weekends, guys. You were working like 50, 60, 70 hours a week to help provide for your families. And unfortunately, because the pay was usually so bad with some of these factories, even if, let's say, mom, dad, and a kid or two are working, you still might not have enough money to scrape together for a decent standard of living. The long hours, the 6 or 7 day work weeks, the lack of pay. And, you know, it was just something that really got to workers after a while. Relying on neighbors or family or private charities to make it through was not a great way to live your life, but it was something that was a real clear reality for so many millions of Americans living in these cities at this time. And like I said, it was about the work. It wasn't about the worker. And as we move on to Section 4, we're going to see a couple of strategies that some of these workers came up with to say, hey, what about us? This isn't fair. We need to take advantage of our lives and our situation and not just the product situation. So despite the fact that this second industrial revolution was such a ginormous time change for Americans and such a great way to promote American prosperity in so many ways, the worker really struggled despite the fact that they were the backbone of this entire time period. So that wraps it up for me. Please feel free to go back and listen to any parts of this and to pause if you need to jot down any notes. I hope this made sense for you guys. If you have any questions, shoot me a remind message or an email. And I'm really excited to take what we've learned here and turn it into a simulation in class. We'll also have a little follow-up pop quiz after the simulation if there's time in class. So please make sure you take accurate notes because that pop quiz will be an open note exercise. Take care. Thanks for visiting my YouTube channel, and I will see you guys in class.